This video will summarise Act 2 of An Inspector Calls, where the inspector interrogates both Gerald, Croft and Mrs. Birling before a shocking revelation occurs. As the curtain fell on the first act, Sheila had uncovered Gerald's affair with Daisy Renton, whom the inspector identified as Eva Smith, who apparently changed her name for a fresh start. The inspector immediately addresses Gerald with, "Well?" which creates an argument between the pair, as Gerald, somewhat condescendingly, asks for Sheila to leave, saying, "She's had a long, exciting and tiring day." Despite this, Sheila insists she wants to stay, and Gerald accuses her of cruelty in, "You've been through it, and now you want to see everybody else put through it." Sheila soon cuts in and argues, "If you'd really loved me, you couldn't have said that," an indication that the inspector's influence is giving her more and more confidence. Soon after, the inspector takes charge and reminds them of Eva or Daisy's tragic fate, dying in misery and agony. Sheila is distressed by this, and the inspector comments, "If there's nothing else, we'll have to share our guilt." At this, Sheila seems intrigued, seeming to regard the inspector with confusion and fascination. Then Mrs. Birling enters and greets the inspector calmly, stating, "I don't think we can help you much." Sheila interjects and warns her mother, "I feel you're beginning all wrong, and I'm afraid you'll say or do something that you'll be sorry for afterwards." Mrs. Birling also tries to dismiss Sheila. "I think you ought to go to bed," and argues, "And in any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class—" Sheila again interjects, before warning Mrs. Birling, "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl." The conversation soon moves on to Eric, whom Mrs. Birling says has had too much to drink. When the inspector inquires if he drinks regularly, Mrs. Birling denies it, calling him "only a boy," before Sheila surprises her by revealing, "He's been steadily drinking too much for the last 2 years." Mrs. Birling is upset by this, and it takes Gerald to confirm it is true. Mr. Birling then enters, saying he's had to convince Eric to go to bed. However, the inspector indicates Eric too has some involvement with the suicide by informing Birling, "I shall want to talk to him, Mr. Birling." Birling tries to take charge, arguing that the inspector is conducting his business wrongly, "and I don't propose to give you much rope." But Sheila again cuts in to warn them all, "No, he's giving us the rope, so that we'll hang ourselves." The conversation soon shifts back to Gerald's involvement with Daisy or Eva. Gerald reveals he met her in the Palace Bar, which he admits is a favourite haunt of women of the town, suggesting that the bar had a reputation for prostitution. He continues, arguing he didn't want to stay long, commenting, "I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women," but then reveals he noticed a pretty girl with brown hair, before he utters, "My God," revealing distress as he recognises she is now dead. Gerald says he had stepped in to help Daisy from Alderman Joe Meggerty, a local council member. Old Joe Meggerty, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. When Mrs. Birling is disbelieving that Meggerty could do such a thing, Gerald adds that Meggerty is a notorious womanizer, as well as being one of the worst sots and rogues in Brumley. Continuing his story, Gerald reveals he had interrupted Meggerty, making up an excuse about a message for him, and offered to take Daisy out of there. He took her to a hotel for a drink. Finding out that Daisy was struggling, Gerald stepped in and offered her a place to stay in a friend's apartment who had travelled to Canada, as well as some money. He pauses to inform the inspector, "I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so I could make love to her." The inspector then questions, "But she became your mistress," which Gerald confirms. But under further questions, he reveals, "I didn't feel about her as she felt about me." Sheila interrupts sarcastically with, "Of course not. You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald." Gerald seems contrite, but argues back when Mrs. Birling calls the affair disgusting. He goes on to reveal that he ended the affair and that Daisy moved out of the rooms, adding, "She'd saved a little money during the summer. She'd lived very economically on what I'd allowed her." The inspector reveals he learned from Eva's diary that she went to live by the seaside for 2 months to get over the breakup, and ends the interview with Gerald, who asks permission to take a walk to be alone. The inspector agrees. Before he exits, Sheila hands back the engagement ring, stating that she respects him more for his truthfulness, but that we'd have to start all over again, getting to know each other. Once Gerald leaves, Sheila tells the inspector he hadn't shown the photograph of Eva to Gerald. The inspector says he thought it was better not to, then shows the photograph to Mrs. Birling, who claims not to recognise Eva. The inspector queries this, and Mrs. Birling becomes angry, before Arthur interjects to demand he apologise, arguing that he is a public man and is inappropriate to question his wife. Taking charge again, the inspector tells him, "Public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges." Soon after, they hear the door slam, and Mr. Birling exits to see who it was. The inspector begins to interview Mrs. Birling about her involvement with a local women's charity. Mrs. Birling is evasive to the inspector's questions about a recent meeting where she had been the chair, and Arthur enters looking agitated and revealing Eric has left. The inspector comments he will need to be back soon, before redirecting the conversation to the charity meeting where Mrs. Birling had seen Eva 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Birling confirms this, but reveals Eva had introduced herself as Mrs. Birling, which she comments, "I think it was simply a piece of gross impertinence," and admits it made her prejudiced against Eva's case. She goes on to say that under questioning, Eva had revealed she was unmarried and had lied about her name. The inspector inquires as to why Eva asked for assistance, and Mrs. Birling is again evasive, eventually becoming combative, arguing, "I consider I did my duty, so if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind." The inspector then reveals that Eva was pregnant. Sheila especially seems shocked and questions how she could kill herself, and Birling asks if the father was Gerald, to which the inspector says no. As he presses Mrs. Birling for more information, Mrs. Birling says, "I tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." Sheila is critical of her mother, and Arthur expresses concern that the decision would look bad for the family if there's an inquest, and the discussion becomes heated. Mrs. Birling argues it was the father's responsibility to marry Eva, not the charity's to help her, and reiterates how Eva was untrustworthy. The inspector becomes irate at Mrs. Birling's refusal to accept responsibility and brutally reminds them of Eva's suicide in, "Her position now is that she lies with a burnt-out inside on a slab." Mrs. Birling also argues that she discovered the father was young and had offered Eva money, which she had refused for reasons Mrs. Birling dismissed as nonsense. She then adds judgmentally, "As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money." Under further intense questioning, Mrs. Birling reveals that the father had stolen the money, but again says she did not believe Eva and rejected her claim, saying, "But I accept no blame for it at all." Then, as Mrs. Birling continues to argue that the unknown father of Eva's child was the one truly responsible, Sheila becomes alarmed, saying, "Mother, stop, stop." Mrs. Birling still refuses to see the truth that Sheila has obviously noticed and asks the inspector to leave, but the inspector calmly waits, checking his watch, saying he's waiting to do my duty. At this, both Birling and Mrs. Birling seem to realise the truth. Mrs. Birling stammers, "But surely, I mean, it's ridiculous." And Mr. Birling says, "Look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this." The inspector soon raises his hand for quiet, as we hear the front door. They wait, Looking towards the door, Eric enters, looking extremely pale and distressed. He meets their inquiring stares. The curtain falls, and it is the end of Act 2.